Welcome, dear viewers, to one of the most dramatic, devastating, and pivotal stories of the Second World War, the Eastern Front, Operation Barbarossa. Today, you are about to embark on a journey across history's largest battlefield, a campaign that stretched thousands of kilometers, claimed millions of lives, and changed the destiny of nations forever. In this documentary, we will dive deep into the clash of two titans, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as they waged a brutal struggle for survival, ideology, and dominance. From the rolling plains of Ukraine to the frozen streets of Stalingrad, from the forests of Belarus to the gates of Moscow, this was a war of unimaginable scale and suffering. Here, soldiers fought with courage and despair, civilians endured unimaginable horrors, and leaders made decisions that would alter the world. Each chapter of this journey will bring you face to face with the fear, the hope, the cruelty, and the resilience that defined the Eastern Front. Stay with us as we uncover the story of Operation Barbarossa, not only as a military campaign but as a human tragedy and triumph, a story etched forever in the memory of mankind. Imagine waking up to the roar of thousands of aircraft darkening the skies, the thunder of tanks crushing the earth, and the sudden terror of a war you never expected. On June 22, 1941, at dawn, the world changed forever. Over 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border in a massive surprise attack, Operation Barbarossa. It was not just an invasion, it was the largest military operation in history. In mere hours, cities were burning, families torn apart, and entire armies encircled. For the people of the Soviet Union, it became a fight for survival. For the German Wehrmacht, it was a gamble for ultimate conquest. And for the world, it was the beginning of the bloodiest front in human history. This is not just the story of generals and battle plans. It is the story of soldiers freezing in trenches, of mothers weeping for their children, of desperate resistance and unimaginable sacrifice. The Eastern Front was a crucible where millions of lives were shattered and where the fate of the Second World War would be decided. In the years leading up to June 1941, the world watched as Adolf Hitler's Germany swept across Europe in a series of lightning campaigns. Poland fell in weeks, France collapsed in mere days, and Britain stood alone, battered yet defiant. But behind Hitler's victories lay a deeper ambition, one rooted in ideology and obsession, the conquest of the Soviet Union. The seeds of Operation Barbarossa were sown long before the war began. Hitler believed that Germany's destiny was tied to Lebensraum, living space in the East. The vast lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were seen not only as resources to fuel his Reich, but as territories to be cleansed of those he deemed inferior. For Hitler, the Soviet Union represented both a prize and a mortal enemy, the land of Judeo-Bolshevism, a regime he swore to destroy. Yet in 1939, Hitler and Stalin shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe. For nearly 2 years, this uneasy partnership held, as both nations carved up Poland and expanded their influence. But to Hitler, the pact was only a temporary convenience, a pause before the inevitable clash. By late 1940, as Britain remained unconquered, Hitler turned his gaze eastward. He was convinced that crushing the Soviet Union would not only secure Germany's dominance in Europe but also force Britain to surrender. In his mind, a lightning strike against the Red Army would topple the Soviet state within months. Stalin, meanwhile, was cautious but unprepared. Despite warnings from his intelligence services, he refused to believe Hitler would risk a two-front war. The Soviet military, weakened by purges and reorganization, was caught in a dangerous state of transition. When the storm came, it would hit with devastating force. Thus, Operation Barbarossa was conceived, the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and a plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign. It was not merely a war of conquest, but a war of annihilation, one that would ignite the bloodiest front in human history. The stage was set. The world stood on the brink of an unimaginable catastrophe. In the early months of 1941, The Soviet Union stood as a giant with feet of clay. On paper, it was a superpower with vast lands, millions of soldiers, and enormous industrial potential. Yet beneath the surface, the Red Army was riddled with weakness, hesitation, and fear, products of both politics and recent history. Joseph Stalin, the supreme leader, ruled with iron control. His purges of the late 1930s had wiped out much of the military's experienced leadership. Thousands of officers were executed or imprisoned, leaving the Red Army's command structure crippled. Young, inexperienced commanders took their place, often too frightened to make independent decisions. Soviet intelligence repeatedly warned Stalin of a looming German invasion. Reports from spies, including the famed Richard Sorge in Tokyo, pointed to Germany massing troops on the western border. But Stalin dismissed these warnings as provocations or even British trickery meant to drag him into war. He trusted the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, believing Hitler would not strike until Britain was defeated. Meanwhile, Soviet industry was mobilizing at a frantic pace. Massive factories in the Urals and Siberia churned out tanks, planes, and rifles. Yet many of these weapons were outdated, and new designs like the T-34 tank were only beginning to reach frontline units. Training was haphazard, communication poor, and coordination between air and ground forces weak. The Soviet people lived in uneasy peace. Villages went about their daily routines, collective farms produced grain, and workers in cities labored long hours in grim industrial plants. But tension was thick in the air. Rumors of war spread, and families whispered about the possibility of German betrayal. Along the western frontier, Red Army units were deployed in vulnerable positions. Many soldiers lacked ammunition, spare parts, or proper fortifications. Instead of preparing for defense, Stalin ordered them not to provoke the Germans, fearing that mobilization might give Hitler an excuse to attack. The Soviet Union before Barbarossa was therefore a paradox, a nation with immense resources and manpower, yet unready for the storm about to break. When the blow came, its initial shock would be devastating, but the resilience and endurance of its people would soon prove decisive in the struggle to come. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the skies over Eastern Europe erupted with thunder. Without warning, the German Wehrmacht unleashed the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,500 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, stormed across an 1,800-mile front, smashing into the Soviet Union with a ferocity never before seen. The first blow came from the Luftwaffe. Hundreds of German bombers roared across the border, targeting Soviet airfields, rail lines, and communication centers. Within hours, thousands of Soviet planes were destroyed, many on the ground, unable to even take off. Pilots ran helplessly toward burning wreckage as German fighters circled above. On the ground, the rumble of panzers shook the earth. Army Group North surged into the Baltic states. Army Group Center drove toward Minsk and Smolensk, and Army Group South plunged into Ukraine. Infantry followed in endless columns, boots pounding dusty roads as artillery thundered behind them. Villages were crushed beneath advancing steel. For Soviet soldiers on the frontier, the attack was sudden and overwhelming. Many were asleep in their barracks when shells began to fall. Communication lines were cut, orders confused, and commanders vanished into chaos. Units fought bravely, but they were scattered, outgunned, and encircled. Entire divisions collapsed in hours. Civilians awoke to a nightmare. Families fled their homes as bombs fell from the sky. Livestock scattered, and flames consumed villages. Mothers clutched children, fathers dug trenches, and old men watched in despair as the horizon glowed red with fire. In Moscow, Stalin was stunned. For hours, he refused to believe Hitler had betrayed the pact. Reports piled up, confirming the disaster, but his silence spread confusion. The Soviet Union had been struck with brutal speed, and for a time, it seemed as though Hitler's dream of a quick victory might come true. June 22, 1941, marked not only the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, but also the beginning of the bloodiest front in world history. In a single day, Europe was thrown into a war of annihilation that would claim millions of lives and reshape the fate of nations. In the days following June 22, 1941, the full scale of Operation Barbarossa became terrifyingly clear. Three massive army groups, North, Center, and South, plowed into Soviet territory with unprecedented speed. The Wehrmacht's strategy was simple but brutal: strike hard, encircle, and destroy. The Red Army, caught off guard and disorganized, struggled to respond. Army Group North surged through the Baltic states, aiming to capture Leningrad. The German advance was relentless. Forests and lakes were crossed with engineering precision, bridges erected within hours, and supply lines maintained with meticulous efficiency. Soviet border guards and outposts fought desperately, but were quickly overrun. Towns were captured in flames, and retreating soldiers were surrounded and annihilated. Army Group Center, the largest formation, pressed into Belarus and toward Smolensk. The sheer speed of the German panzers created massive encirclements, trapping entire Soviet divisions in so-called pockets, Kesselschlacht. Communications broke down, reinforcements could not arrive, and Soviet units were decimated. The psychological impact was devastating. Panic spread among soldiers and civilians alike. In the south, Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, aiming for Kiev and the rich agricultural lands. Battles erupted in villages and open fields, with artillery barrages and aerial attacks leaving devastation in their wake. The Soviet defenders were brave but poorly coordinated. Some units fought heroically, others surrendered en masse, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the attack. The Luftwaffe continued to dominate the skies. German bombers destroyed rail lines, bridges, and supply depots, while fighter planes strafed retreating Soviet columns. Without air support, Soviet ground units were almost defenseless. Entire cities faced bombardment, infrastructure collapsed, and panic among the population escalated. Meanwhile, Stalin remained largely silent in Moscow. Orders were contradictory. Some commanders were told to hold positions at all costs, while others were instructed to retreat. The result was chaos, and many frontline units were effectively abandoned. The first weeks of Barbarossa revealed the deadly efficiency of the German war machine. The combination of tanks, infantry, and aircraft, the blitzkrieg, proved devastating. Soviet forces suffered massive losses, but the invasion also sowed the seeds of resistance. Partisan groups began forming behind German lines. Civilians learned to hide and survive, and even in retreat, the Red Army began to adapt. By the end of this initial phase, millions of lives had been disrupted or destroyed. Operation Barbarossa was not just an invasion, it was the beginning of a war of annihilation that would engulf the entire Eastern Front. By early July 1941, Operation Barbarossa had transformed the Eastern Front into a whirlwind of speed, fire, and destruction. The German military strategy, the blitzkrieg, lightning war, proved devastatingly effective. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft moved in unison, striking deep into Soviet territory, encircling armies, and crushing resistance wherever it appeared. Army Group North pressed relentlessly through the Baltic states. Towns that had stood for centuries fell in days. Soviet defenders were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of German forces. Forests and rivers, often seen as natural obstacles, were swiftly overcome by engineering units and mobile columns. The citizens of Riga, Tallinn, and Kaunas watched in disbelief as the invaders swept through their streets with almost mechanical precision. In the center, Army Group Center advanced toward Smolensk and the heart of Belarus. The rapid maneuvering of panzer divisions created massive encirclements known as kessels. Entire Soviet armies were trapped and annihilated, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and destroyed equipment. Communication breakdowns among Soviet units led to chaos, as units fought in isolation, often unaware of the broader tactical situation. To the south, Army Group South tore through Ukraine's plains, targeting Kiev and its strategic railway hubs. The blitzkrieg relied on surprise, mobility, and concentrated force, and here, it achieved remarkable success. Soviet units tried to resist, but German firepower and coordination left them little chance. Cities burned, railways were destroyed, and the countryside was littered with abandoned equipment. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies amplified the destruction on the ground. German bombers and fighters strafed retreating Soviet units and disrupted supply lines. With Soviet air power largely neutralized, German forces faced minimal interference from the skies, allowing them to maintain momentum. The psychological impact was immense. Soviet soldiers, unprepared for the scale and speed of the attack, often broke ranks under pressure. Civilians fled ahead of the advancing columns, seeking refuge in forests and small towns. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and the once bustling towns now lay in ruins. Yet, the Blitzkrieg, for all its initial brilliance, was only the beginning. While German forces advanced at extraordinary speed, the vastness of Soviet territory, harsh conditions, and growing resistance hinted that total conquest would be far from simple. The stage was set for months of brutal combat where the human cost would be staggering, and the true test of endurance for both armies was yet to come. By late June 1941, the German advance had created an alarming situation for the Red Army in Belarus. Army Group Center, spearheaded by panzer divisions, moved with lightning speed toward Minsk, the strategic heart of the region. The city and surrounding areas became a deadly trap, a Kessel, where entire Soviet armies would be encircled and annihilated. Soviet commanders tried to organize a defense, but confusion and chaos dominated. Communication lines were severed by Luftwaffe air raids and German sabotage, leaving units isolated and uninformed. Soldiers, many still unprepared for frontline combat, were thrown into desperate defensive positions, often without ammunition or artillery support. German forces executed a textbook encirclement. Mechanized units pierced the Soviet flanks, cutting off escape routes, while infantry followed to consolidate control. Artillery and air support bombarded Soviet positions relentlessly. Within days, Soviet divisions found themselves surrounded on three sides, their options dwindling rapidly. The psychological toll was enormous. Red Army soldiers fought bravely but knew they were trapped. Panic set in as entire regiments were destroyed or forced to surrender. Civilians in Minsk and surrounding towns faced bombing raids, fires, and the sudden arrival of German troops. Families fled, seeking refuge wherever they could, but escape was often impossible. Minsk itself fell swiftly. Streets that had been bustling with trade and daily life became silent under German occupation. The city's capture allowed the Germans to secure supply lines and prepare for further advances toward Smolensk and Moscow. It was a significant tactical victory that showcased the devastating effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg. Despite the destruction, the Soviet spirit was not entirely broken. Many soldiers managed to slip through encirclements, retreating to regroup and fight another day. Partisan networks began forming, and intelligence units documented the atrocities, preparing for resistance behind enemy lines. The encirclement at Minsk became a stark example of how speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower could dictate the fate of entire armies. It was a lesson that would echo throughout the Eastern Front, a reminder of the deadly efficiency of German planning and the immense human cost borne by those caught in the maelstrom. By mid-July 1941, Army Group Center had pushed deep into Soviet territory, and the city of Smolensk became the next crucial objective. Unlike previous engagements, the Battle of Smolensk was not a swift German victory. The Red Army, learning from earlier disasters, mounted a determined defense. The city and its surrounding forests became a deadly arena of resistance, marking a turning point in the pace of Operation Barbarossa. German panzer divisions struck with their usual speed, attempting to encircle Soviet forces and advance toward Moscow. Yet, Soviet units dug in, establishing defensive positions along rivers, forests, and villages. Trenches, barricades, and hastily built fortifications slowed the German advance. Artillery fire and counterattacks harassed the attackers, demonstrating that Soviet resistance was far from broken. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombarding the city and surrounding positions, but the dense terrain and urban areas limited its effectiveness. Soviet anti-aircraft guns, though limited in number, forced pilots to maneuver carefully, and small pockets of resistance inflicted costly losses on German forces. Fighting in Smolensk was fierce and brutal. German infantry cleared buildings street by street, often encountering ambushes and sniper fire. Panzer units navigated forests and swamps, attempting to cut off retreating Soviet divisions. Soviet soldiers displayed remarkable courage, sacrificing themselves to slow the enemy and protect key positions. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled the city in panic, seeking safety in the countryside. Despite heavy German pressure, the Red Army managed to execute partial retreats, preventing complete encirclement. These maneuvers allowed thousands of soldiers to survive, regroup, and continue fighting further east. The city's defense, though ultimately overcome, demonstrated that Soviet forces were adapting, learning the value of delay tactics and urban warfare. The struggle for Smolensk foreshadowed the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. German victories, while spectacular, were no longer effortless. The sheer size of the Soviet Union, combined with determined resistance, would begin to stretch the limits of logistics, manpower, and morale. Smolensk became a symbol, the first sign that Operation Barbarossa, though devastating, might not achieve a rapid total victory. While Army Group Center battled through Belarus and toward Smolensk, Army Group North pressed relentlessly through the Baltic states, aiming for Leningrad, the Soviet Union's cultural and industrial jewel. The northern advance highlighted both the brilliance of German operational planning and the resilience of Soviet defenders determined to protect their homeland. By early July 1941, German forces had captured Riga, Tallinn, and other key cities in Latvia and Estonia. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority, bombing military installations and rail lines, while panzer divisions and infantry units moved swiftly along the network of roads and railways. Despite the efficiency of the German advance, the terrain posed challenges. Dense forests, rivers, and marshes slowed mechanized units, while Soviet rearguard actions harassed supply lines. The Soviet defenders, though outnumbered and poorly equipped, fought fiercely. Red Army units fortified key towns, setting up artillery positions, barricades, and minefields. Local militia and volunteer groups supplemented regular troops, motivated by patriotism and fear of occupation. Snipers, sabotage operations, and ambushes inflicted steady casualties on German forces, showing that even a rapid advance could not come without cost. By mid-July, the German army had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. The city's defenses were being prepared by Soviet engineers and soldiers, who converted factories, schools, and public buildings into fortifications. Civilians joined in the construction of barricades, dug trenches, and prepared to resist the impending siege. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaigns attempted to soften the city's defenses, but the resilience of its people was evident. The northern drive illustrated the duality of Operation Barbarossa. Rapid advances in some sectors contrasted with stubborn resistance in others. Army Group North's progress toward Leningrad would ultimately lead to one of the most prolonged and tragic sieges in human history. Civilians and soldiers alike would endure starvation, bombardment, and freezing winters, yet their determination to hold the city would become legendary. The drive to Leningrad showcased both the strategic genius and the hubris of the German High Command. They underestimated the capacity of the Soviet Union to endure, to adapt, and to resist. In the forests and frozen landscapes of the north, the stage was set for months of grueling warfare, where courage, desperation, and survival would collide in one of the most infamous campaigns of the Eastern Front. By late July 1941, Army Group Center had pushed past Smolensk, leaving destruction and chaos in its wake. The German High Command set its sights on Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, and a symbolic target that represented both military and political power. Capturing the capital quickly would, in Hitler's mind, force the Soviet state to collapse. The advance toward Moscow was initially rapid. German panzer divisions struck deep into the open plains of Russia, bypassing fortified positions where possible and encircling remaining Soviet units. Roads were congested with tanks, trucks, and infantry, all moving in concert with Luftwaffe support. German engineers repaired damaged bridges and cleared obstacles to maintain the momentum. Soviet forces, though battered, were determined to slow the Germans. Defensive lines were hastily constructed along rivers and major roadways. Artillery units attempted to disrupt German formations while infantry dug in to resist mechanized attacks. The Red Army learned from earlier encirclements and began executing organized retreats, sacrificing territory to preserve manpower for future battles. Civilians in towns and villages along the route faced terror daily. Air raids, artillery fire, and ground combat left homes in ruins. Families fled with what they could carry, seeking refuge further east. Yet, even in retreat, Soviet resistance persisted, leaving German forces stretched thin over a vast and unforgiving landscape. Despite initial successes, the march toward Moscow revealed challenges that would grow into major problems: extended supply lines, logistical bottlenecks, and the approaching Russian winter. The human and material cost of rapid advance began to weigh heavily on the Wehrmacht, signaling that even a city like Moscow would not fall without a monumental effort. While Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, Army Group South plunged into Ukraine, a region of fertile plains, strategic cities, and vital railways. The campaign aimed to secure resources, destroy Soviet forces in the south, and pave the way for future operations against the Caucasus and beyond. German forces advanced swiftly, employing blitzkrieg tactics to encircle Soviet units and capture key towns. Panzer divisions moved in spearhead formations, with infantry following to consolidate captured territory. The Luftwaffe provided close air support, bombing Soviet positions and supply routes. The Ukrainian campaign quickly escalated into large-scale battles. Soviet defenders fought fiercely, particularly around strategic locations such as Kiev. Though outnumbered and outgunned, Red Army units leveraged rivers, forests, and urban centers to slow German progress. Artillery barrages, defensive fortifications, and small counterattacks inflicted losses on the invaders. Civilians in Ukraine endured widespread disruption. Villages and cities were bombed or occupied. Families fled ahead of advancing columns, and refugees crowded roads in desperate flight. Farms were abandoned, livestock left behind, and towns burned under the relentless advance of German forces. Despite the initial successes, the scale of the campaign and the determined resistance revealed the immense challenge of conquering the Soviet Union. Army Group South would continue its march, but the human cost was already staggering, and the seeds of Soviet resilience and partisan resistance were taking root. The Ukrainian campaign underscored the dual nature of Barbarossa. Operational brilliance in German planning contrasted with brutal, grinding combat that tested both soldiers and civilians alike. It was a war where speed and firepower clashed with endurance and courage, setting the tone for months of devastating conflict on the Eastern Front. As Operation Barbarossa unfolded, the Luftwaffe emerged as one of the most decisive tools in the German arsenal. Air superiority allowed the Wehrmacht to move swiftly, encircle Soviet units, and disrupt logistics. By controlling the skies, German forces struck fear into soldiers and civilians alike, setting the tone for a campaign of unprecedented scale. The Luftwaffe's primary missions were multifaceted: bomb Soviet airfields to neutralize aircraft on the ground, disrupt rail and supply networks, provide close air support for advancing panzer and infantry units, and execute reconnaissance to guide strategic decisions. Within hours of the invasion, thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, leaving the Red Army with limited air defense capabilities. Bombing raids targeted towns, rail junctions, and military depots. The destruction of transportation hubs slowed Soviet troop movements and created chaos behind the front lines. Artillery positions and defensive fortifications were relentlessly shelled from the air, enabling German tanks and infantry to advance with reduced resistance. Despite initial successes, the Luftwaffe faced challenges. Dense forests, urban areas, and unpredictable weather sometimes limited visibility and effectiveness. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, though sparse, inflicted casualties, and scattered resistance from pilots attempting desperate sorties kept German crews alert. The psychological impact of air raids on both soldiers and civilians was profound. Smoke and fire painted the horizon, buildings crumbled under bomb blasts, and the deafening roar of aircraft instilled terror. Civilians fled towns in panic, and soldiers often found it difficult to maintain morale under constant bombardment. The Luftwaffe's domination of the skies demonstrated how modern warfare combined land and air power into a cohesive strategy. Its effectiveness accelerated German advances, inflicted heavy losses, and sowed disarray across Soviet lines. Yet, even as the skies seemed dominated by the Germans, the vastness of the Soviet Union meant that complete air control would always be challenged, foreshadowing the long and grueling battles yet to come. As the German juggernaut pressed deeper into Soviet territory, pockets of resistance began to emerge. Though initially overwhelmed, the Red Army and Soviet partisans began striking back with tactical counterattacks designed to slow the German advance and regain lost ground. The first counterblows occurred along the fringes of the encirclement at Smolensk. Surviving Soviet units reorganized quickly, exploiting gaps in German lines to launch surprise attacks on supply columns and isolated garrisons. Infantry assaults, ambushes, and artillery barrages inflicted notable casualties and created confusion among German forces. The Soviets also leveraged intelligence and local knowledge. Scouts, reconnaissance units, and partisan networks provided critical information about German movements, enabling targeted strikes on weak points. Bridges were sabotaged, roads mined, and communication lines disrupted. Even a small determined force could halt or delay an advancing panzer division for hours, buying precious time for reinforcements. Civilians played a critical role in supporting counterattacks. Some supplied food and shelter to retreating soldiers, while others assisted partisans behind German lines. These acts of resistance were subtle but significant, demonstrating that the fight for survival extended beyond conventional battlefields. The psychological impact on German forces was notable. After weeks of rapid success, sudden attacks from unseen enemies created tension and uncertainty. Morale began to fluctuate as soldiers realized the vastness of the territory and the resilience of their opponents. Though these early counterblows were limited in scale, they signaled a shift. The Soviet Union was not collapsing under the weight of Barbarossa. Instead, it was adapting, learning, and preparing for a long struggle. The counterattacks demonstrated that determination, strategy, and knowledge of the terrain could challenge even the most disciplined and well-equipped army. The stage was set for a grinding war of attrition. The Red Army, though battered, had begun to assert itself, while the Germans realized that speed alone might not guarantee victory. These early Soviet counterblows were a precursor to the fierce, large-scale battles that would define the Eastern Front in the months to come. By late August 1941, Army Group South focused on Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and a vital strategic hub for the Soviet Union. The city's capture would secure southern supply lines and deal a blow to Soviet morale. Yet, Kiev would prove to be more than just another target. It would become the site of one of the largest encirclements in military history. German forces advanced along multiple axes, combining armored spearheads with infantry to envelop the city. Panzer divisions cut through forests and plains, bypassing strong points to encircle Soviet positions. Artillery and Luftwaffe support softened defenses, while engineers cleared obstacles to maintain momentum. Roads were congested with advancing units, yet coordination allowed for remarkable speed and efficiency. Soviet defenders prepared for a brutal stand. Red Army units, bolstered by local militia, fortified key positions along rivers, railways, and urban centers. Trenches, barricades, and minefields slowed the German advance, and counterattacks were launched where possible. Civilians were pressed into service, assisting with fortifications, transporting supplies, and evacuating families from danger zones. Despite fierce resistance, German forces gradually encircled Kiev. Panzer units maneuvered to cut off escape routes, while infantry closed in from the flanks. the Luftwaffe continued its relentless bombardment, targeting rail hubs, bridges, and troop concentrations. The pressure on Soviet forces intensified, creating pockets of chaos within the city and its outskirts. The battle for Kiev showcased the devastating effectiveness of combined arms warfare. German coordination of air, armor, and infantry allowed them to outmaneuver and isolate Soviet forces. Yet, it also highlighted the resilience of defenders who fought bravely despite overwhelming odds. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would define the southern campaign of Barbarossa. By early September 1941, the encirclement of Soviet forces at Kiev was nearly complete. German panzer divisions, operating with precision and speed, had cut off multiple escape routes, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in a massive cauldron of destruction. The encirclement at Kiev would become one of the largest in history, demonstrating both the brilliance and brutality of blitzkrieg tactics. Soviet forces inside the pocket fought desperately. Infantry units tried to hold lines along rivers and railways, artillery fired relentlessly at advancing Germans, and small counterattacks attempted to break the encirclement. However, supply shortages, exhaustion, and relentless German pressure made these efforts increasingly futile. The Luftwaffe intensified its attacks, bombing Soviet positions, supply dumps, and rail lines to prevent reinforcement or escape. Smoke and fire filled the horizon, creating an apocalyptic landscape. Civilians caught in the encirclement faced starvation, destruction, and constant bombardment, adding to the human tragedy of the battle. Despite overwhelming odds, Soviet units demonstrated resilience. Some divisions managed small breakouts, allowing a fraction of soldiers to escape the encirclement, yet the majority were captured or destroyed, marking a catastrophic loss for the Red Army. The scale of the defeat was staggering, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost and vast amounts of equipment destroyed or seized by the Germans. The encirclement at Kiev underscored the deadly effectiveness of German combined arms tactics. Coordination between panzer units, infantry, and the Luftwaffe created operational perfection in isolation, but human cost was immense. Civilians, soldiers, and entire communities bore the brunt of this military machine, leaving a trail of devastation across Ukraine. The Battle of Kiev was a chilling reminder that while blitzkrieg brought rapid victories, it came with catastrophic consequences for those caught in its path. It also revealed that, despite staggering losses, Soviet resilience would endure, setting the stage for prolonged conflict in the south and foreshadowing the tenacity that would define later campaigns. By September 1941, Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad, marking the beginning of one of the most infamous sieges in history. Unlike previous German advances, the attack on Leningrad would not result in a swift victory. Instead, the city would endure a blockade that would test the limits of human endurance, courage, and survival. German forces encircled the city from the south and west, cutting off railways, roads, and access to supplies. Panzer divisions prepared for urban assault, while infantry secured the surrounding countryside. Artillery units shelled the city's outskirts, aiming to weaken defenses and create panic among the population. Luftwaffe bombers conducted relentless raids, targeting military installations and key infrastructure. Soviet defenders, including soldiers, militia, and civilians, organized a coordinated defense. Barricades were erected in streets, factories converted into fortresses, and trenches dug along critical approaches. Civilians assisted by transporting food, water, and ammunition, while some volunteered for auxiliary combat roles. Women and children worked tirelessly to maintain essential services and care for the wounded. The psychological toll of the siege was immense. Air raids, artillery bombardments, and the looming threat of starvation created an atmosphere of constant fear. Yet the citizens of Leningrad displayed extraordinary resilience, determined to survive and defend their city at all costs. Streets became battlefields, factories transformed into military strongholds, and every corner of the city became a potential defensive position. The siege of Leningrad would last over 2 years, resulting in unimaginable suffering and loss of life. Starvation, disease, and continuous bombardment pushed the population to the brink. However, the city's resistance also became a symbol of Soviet endurance and defiance. The initial encirclement marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle that would shape the course of the Eastern Front and the war itself. By late 1941, German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory, but the onset of winter began to transform the landscape into a deadly adversary. Harsh temperatures, frozen rivers, and snow-covered plains challenged the Wehrmacht as much as Soviet resistance. The first winter on the Eastern Front would prove to be a trial of endurance, logistics, and survival for both soldiers and civilians. German units, accustomed to speed and mobility, faced freezing temperatures, equipment failures, and supply shortages. Tanks became immobilized in frozen mud, weapons jammed in sub-zero conditions, and roads turned into ice-laden hazards. Fuel and food shortages further weakened the effectiveness of the advancing armies. Soviet defenders, more accustomed to winter conditions, leveraged the harsh climate to their advantage. Trenches were dug deeper, frozen rivers used as defensive barriers, and guerrilla operations disrupted German supply lines. Civilians, facing both occupation and winter, adapted as best they could, using forests for shelter and rivers for transport. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical. Soldiers endured frostbite, exhaustion, and isolation. The relentless cold amplified fear and fatigue, testing morale and resolve. Civilians struggled to survive, rationing meager supplies and coping with the dual threats of combat and freezing temperatures. Despite these hardships, the German High Command underestimated the effects of the Russian winter. Planning for a rapid victory failed to account for the extended campaign, leaving troops vulnerable. The first winter revealed that Barbarossa's blitzkrieg, though initially successful, could be slowed and eventually halted by both human and natural resistance. The first winter on the Eastern Front was a turning point. It foreshadowed the brutal and attritional battles that would define the next phase of the war, demonstrating that victory would require more than speed and firepower. Survival, adaptation, and resilience would become as critical as tactics and strategy. By November 1941, Army Group South pushed into southern Russia, approaching the city of Rostov-on-Don, a key gateway to the Caucasus and vital oil fields. German forces sought to secure the city to control the southern front and maintain momentum. Yet, the battle revealed both the strategic importance of Rostov and the growing challenges faced by the Wehrmacht. German panzer divisions and infantry advanced through the Don River plains, facing resistance from entrenched Soviet forces. Artillery barrages and Luftwaffe strikes attempted to weaken defenses, but Soviet troops had prepared strong positions along the river and in surrounding villages. The terrain, consisting of rivers, forests, and urban areas, slowed the German advance and complicated coordination. Soviet defenders, though pressured, displayed remarkable resilience. Infantry fortified buildings, trenches, and natural barriers. Engineers laid mines and sabotaged bridges, forcing the Germans to adapt their tactics. Artillery fire disrupted panzer columns, while Soviet reconnaissance units monitored German movements, enabling timely counterattacks. The initial German assault succeeded in capturing the city, but overextension of supply lines and the harsh onset of winter made holding Rostov challenging. Soviet counterattacks exploited gaps in German defenses, threatening encirclement and forcing a temporary retreat. The battle marked one of the first instances where German forces were compelled to withdraw due to combined Soviet resistance and logistical difficulties. Civilians in Rostov faced bombing raids, artillery fire, and the chaos of occupation and retreat. Many fled the city, while others struggled to survive amidst destruction and freezing temperatures. The human cost was severe, highlighting that strategic gains came with immense suffering. The Battle of Rostov demonstrated the limits of blitzkrieg when facing determined defense, difficult terrain, and logistical strain. It foreshadowed the challenges that would define the German campaign in southern Russia and the eventual protracted struggle for control over critical regions like the Caucasus. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the vast countryside became a breeding ground for partisan warfare. Small bands of Soviet partisans began harassing supply lines, ambushing convoys, and disrupting communications, transforming the hinterlands into a dangerous and unpredictable battlefield. Partisans, often composed of escaped soldiers, local peasants, and civilians, used their intimate knowledge of forests, swamps, and villages to strike German forces unexpectedly. They sabotaged railways, destroyed bridges, and ambushed isolated patrols, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops and resources to guard supply routes. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Units that had advanced rapidly through open terrain now faced hidden enemies, constant attacks, and the threat of mines and improvised explosives. Morale was challenged as even routine movements became dangerous, and commanders realized that the vast Soviet hinterlands could never be fully controlled. Soviet partisans coordinated with Red Army units where possible, sharing intelligence and targeting vulnerable German positions. Civilians supported them by providing shelter, food, and guidance through forests. These guerrilla operations demonstrated that resistance was not limited to the front lines. The entire occupied territory became a battlefield. German reprisals against suspected partisan activity were brutal, targeting villages and civilians suspected of aiding resistance. Yet despite this, partisan activities persisted, growing in scale and intensity. The emergence of partisan warfare signaled that the Eastern Front would not be a straightforward campaign of blitzkrieg, but a complex struggle involving both conventional and irregular warfare. The rise of partisan activity also highlighted the resilience of the Soviet population. Ordinary civilians became fighters, and the war extended beyond armies to entire communities. German advances were slowed, supply lines disrupted, and the human and material costs increased significantly, shaping the nature of the prolonged conflict that would define the Eastern Front. By late August 1941, the Germans had advanced deeply into Soviet territory, but the Red Army began organizing its first major counteroffensive in the Yelnya salient, a bulge in the German lines southwest of Moscow. This operation marked a turning point. For the first time, the Soviets demonstrated they could plan and execute coordinated counterattacks, challenging the previously unstoppable German advance. The Yelnya salient was heavily fortified by German forces, with trenches, bunkers, and artillery emplacements. Soviet planners recognized the need for coordination between infantry, artillery, and limited armored units to breach these defenses. Despite shortages of equipment and supplies, the Red Army amassed thousands of soldiers for a concentrated assault on the salient. The fighting was intense. Soviet infantry advanced under artillery cover, while tanks and armored vehicles attempted to break through fortified positions. German troops fought fiercely, using machine guns, artillery, and coordinated counterattacks to hold their lines. The air war was also significant. The Luftwaffe attempted to support ground troops, while Soviet aircraft harassed German positions wherever possible. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the Red Army made progress. Villages changed hands multiple times as infantry engaged in brutal close-quarters combat. German supply lines were stretched thin, creating vulnerabilities that Soviet forces exploited. The counteroffensive inflicted meaningful losses on the Germans, demonstrating that the Soviet army was learning and adapting. Civilians in the region endured enormous hardships. Bombings, artillery fire, and the movement of troops turned towns and villages into battlefields. Many fled the fighting, seeking refuge wherever possible, while others aided the Soviet troops by providing food, shelter, or intelligence about German positions. The success of the Yelnya counteroffensive, modest as it was, sent a powerful message: the Soviet Union could fight back, even under extreme pressure. German commanders began to realize that the Eastern Front would not be a campaign of swift victories, but a prolonged struggle that required sustained effort and resources. By October 1941, Army Group South turned its attention to Odessa, the fortified port city on the Black Sea. Capturing Odessa was critical for securing southern supply lines and maintaining pressure on Soviet forces in Ukraine. The siege of Odessa became a prolonged and bloody struggle, reflecting both the strategic value of the city and the determination of its defenders. German and Romanian forces laid siege to Odessa, surrounding the city and cutting off supply routes. Artillery barrages and aerial bombardments softened defenses, while infantry and engineers prepared for assaults on the city's fortifications. The defenders, a mix of Soviet troops and local volunteers, used the terrain to their advantage, establishing strong points in urban areas and along the coastline. The siege was brutal. Infantry engaged in house-to-house fighting, artillery shells leveled buildings, and naval forces provided limited support for Soviet defenders. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, struggling to survive amidst collapsing infrastructure and relentless attacks. Hospitals, schools, and public buildings were converted into military strongholds and shelters. Despite fierce resistance, the city's defenders were gradually overwhelmed by the sheer weight of German and Romanian forces. Supplies dwindled and continuous bombardment exhausted both soldiers and civilians. By mid-October, Odessa fell, and the occupying forces took control of the port, securing a strategic advantage for operations in southern Ukraine and the Black Sea region. The fall of Odessa was a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, and civilians endured immense suffering. Yet, the courage displayed by defenders left a lasting legacy, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resistance was possible. The siege also reinforced the importance of combined operations. Coordination between infantry, artillery, air power, and naval support proved decisive. German and Allied forces demonstrated operational effectiveness, while Soviet forces learned crucial lessons that would inform future defensive and counteroffensive operations. After the fall of Odessa, German and Romanian forces turned their attention to Sevastopol, the heavily fortified port city on the Crimean Peninsula. Sevastopol was vital due to its strategic naval base and control over the Black Sea, making its capture a key objective in the southern campaign. The siege would test both the planning and endurance of the Axis forces as they faced a resolute Soviet defense. The German 11th Army, under General Erich von Manstein, spearheaded the assault, combining infantry, artillery, and engineering units. Romanian troops secured flanks and supply routes, while the Luftwaffe provided aerial bombardment to weaken fortifications. The advance was meticulously coordinated, with artillery barrages softening defensive positions before infantry attacks. Soviet defenders had transformed Sevastopol into a fortress. Coastal batteries, anti-tank positions, and reinforced bunkers created a layered defense designed to repel attackers. Soldiers and local civilians participated in fortifying positions, constructing obstacles, and preparing for prolonged resistance. Artillery fire and mines slowed the German advance, while counterattacks inflicted casualties and forced adjustments to Axis plans. The siege demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations. Engineers cleared obstacles, tanks provided fire support, and aircraft bombarded strong points. Despite heavy resistance, German forces gradually advanced, capturing outlying positions and tightening the encirclement. However, progress was slow, highlighting the difficulty of assaulting a well-prepared fortified city. Civilians in Sevastopol endured relentless bombardment and shortages of food and medical supplies. Many took refuge in shelters, hospitals, and basements, facing constant fear and uncertainty. Despite the hardships, their resilience became a symbol of Soviet determination to resist occupation. The drive to Sevastopol was not merely a military campaign. It was a test of endurance, coordination, and tactical ingenuity. German forces realized that victory over fortified positions required patience, meticulous planning, and overwhelming force. The siege foreshadowed the prolonged struggle for control of Crimea and the high cost of urban and fortified warfare on the Eastern Front. By late November 1941, the siege of Sevastopol intensified as German forces sought to breach the city's formidable defenses. The initial stages of encirclement had secured outlying positions, but the heart of the fortress city remained well defended. Progress became slow, costly, and brutally demanding, highlighting the challenges of prolonged siege warfare on the Eastern Front. Artillery barrages increased in frequency and intensity. German heavy guns and mortars targeted bunkers, defensive walls, and coastal batteries. Luftwaffe bombers conducted precision strikes on supply depots, barracks, and communication lines, attempting to weaken the defenders' resolve. Engineers prepared for assaults on fortified gates and obstacles, while infantry advanced cautiously through mined areas. Soviet defenders demonstrated remarkable tenacity. Soldiers held bunkers under intense bombardment, repelling infantry advances and launching counterattacks where possible. Engineers repaired damaged defenses, laid mines, and reinforced barricades. Civilians contributed by transporting supplies, providing medical aid, and assisting soldiers wherever possible. The combined effort of soldiers and civilians slowed the German advance and prolonged the siege. The harsh Crimean winter further complicated operations. Freezing temperatures, snow and ice hampered movement, created logistical challenges, and tested endurance. Soldiers faced frostbite, equipment failures, and fatigue. Civilians suffered from scarcity of food and medical supplies, living under constant threat of bombardment and collapse of infrastructure. The tightening siege reflected the immense cost of urban and fortified warfare. Every meter of ground gained required careful planning, immense coordination, and repeated assaults. German commanders recognized that capturing Sevastopol would demand overwhelming force and sacrifice. For the Soviets, the city became a symbol of resistance, demonstrating courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Sevastopol's siege highlighted the nature of the Eastern Front, a brutal contest where strategy, endurance, and human determination clashed against one another. The conflict foreshadowed the high casualties, logistical challenges, and prolonged battles that would define the campaign in the South and throughout the Soviet Union. By late November 1941, the Battle of Rostov revealed the growing vulnerability of German forces on the Eastern Front. Initially, German troops had captured the city, but overextended supply lines, harsh winter conditions, and determined Soviet counterattacks forced a dramatic withdrawal, marking one of the first significant German retreats in the campaign. The Wehrmacht faced multiple challenges. Frozen roads hindered movement, tanks became immobilized in snow and ice, and infantry struggled with frostbite and exhaustion. Soviet forces, recovering from earlier setbacks, launched effective counterattacks, using artillery, infantry, and small armored units to exploit gaps in German lines. The combination of environmental and military pressures made holding Rostov untenable. The retreat was meticulously organized. German units pulled back under cover of artillery fire and Luftwaffe support, attempting to minimize casualties while preserving as much equipment as possible. Panzer divisions covered infantry withdrawals, while engineers demolished bridges and obstacles to slow Soviet pursuit. Despite careful planning, the retreat was fraught with danger, with pockets of troops cut off and heavy losses inflicted. Civilians experienced the chaos firsthand. Bombed districts, freezing temperatures, and the movement of armies created widespread suffering. Many fled the city, while others struggled to survive amidst destruction and occupation. The human cost of the withdrawal was severe, underscoring the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. The German withdrawal from Rostov was a turning point. It demonstrated that Soviet resilience, combined with the challenges of winter warfare and overextended logistics, could halt and even reverse German advances. For the Red Army, it was a symbolic and strategic victory, signaling that the tide could shift even against the formidable Wehrmacht. As December 1941 approached, the Eastern Front entered a critical phase. The Soviet winter counteroffensive aimed to halt the German advance on Moscow, marking the first large-scale pushback against the Wehrmacht. Harsh winter conditions, combined with strategic planning and renewed Soviet determination, created an unprecedented challenge for German forces. German troops, exhausted and undersupplied, faced frostbite, snow-blocked roads, and shortages of fuel and ammunition. Tanks and vehicles were immobilized, and infantry struggled to maintain positions against relentless Soviet assaults. Morale began to waver as the reality of winter warfare set in. The Soviet counteroffensive leveraged both numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Red Army divisions attacked over a broad front, coordinating infantry, artillery, and armored units to break German positions. Guerrilla actions behind the lines disrupted supply routes, while local partisans provided intelligence and support. The combined effect was a relentless push that German forces could not easily counter. Fighting was fierce and chaotic. Villages changed hands multiple times, snow-covered fields became battlegrounds, and artillery and tank duels raged across frozen landscapes. Civilians faced starvation, bombardment, and displacement, yet many assisted Soviet forces by providing food, shelter, or guidance through harsh conditions. The winter counteroffensive demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most disciplined army when logistics, weather, and determined resistance converge. German forces were forced into defensive positions for the first time since the start of Barbarossa, and the advance toward Moscow stalled. The Soviet push not only saved the capital, but also sent a powerful message: the Red Army could fight, adapt, and endure. It was a turning point that foreshadowed the protracted, grueling struggle that would characterize the Eastern Front in the coming years, highlighting the crucial interplay of strategy, environment, and human resilience. By early 1942, the siege of Leningrad had tightened into an iron grip. German and Finnish forces encircled the city from multiple directions, cutting off almost all supply lines. The city's population faced starvation, cold, and relentless bombardment, but the defenders' spirit remained unbroken. Leningrad had become a symbol of Soviet endurance, where civilians and soldiers alike endured unimaginable suffering for the sake of survival and resistance. German forces bombarded industrial areas, rail lines, and military positions, aiming to break the defenders' capacity to resist. Artillery barrages shook buildings, while Luftwaffe bombers targeted supply depots and infrastructure. Engineers cleared obstacles and prepared for potential assaults, but progress was slow due to fierce Soviet resistance and the city's fortified layout. Inside Leningrad, civilians faced extreme hardships. Food shortages led to rationing, and many relied on scavenging, fishing, or even consuming unconventional sources of nourishment. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and families sheltered in basements to escape shelling. Despite this, the citizens' resilience and ingenuity became vital for survival, with women, children, and the elderly contributing to defense efforts and maintaining essential services. Soviet soldiers manned barricades, patrolled streets, and maintained communication with outlying fortifications. Engineers repaired damages to infrastructure and coordinated with artillery units to maximize defensive effectiveness. Guerrilla fighters harassed enemy supply lines outside the city, slowing German reinforcements and keeping pressure on the encircling forces. The siege of Leningrad highlighted the deadly combination of urban warfare, attrition, and environmental hardship. German forces, despite technological and numerical superiority, found the city's resistance difficult to overcome. The population's determination and the defenders' strategic use of fortifications and resources showcased human resilience under extreme duress. Leningrad's siege was more than a military engagement, it was a testament to endurance, courage, and sacrifice. It foreshadowed the brutal and drawn-out battles that would define the Eastern Front and underscored that victory would be measured not only in territory gained but also in the human cost endured. In early 1942, the city of Kharkov became a focal point in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. Located in eastern Ukraine, Kharkov was a major industrial hub and strategic railway junction, making it a critical objective for both German and Soviet forces. The battle there highlighted the ebb and flow of initiative on the Eastern Front, as both sides sought to gain control over vital infrastructure. German forces aimed to consolidate their position in southern Ukraine after previous successes and retreats. Armored divisions spearheaded attacks, supported by infantry and artillery, while Luftwaffe bombers targeted Soviet positions and supply lines. Coordination between units was crucial to penetrate heavily fortified defensive lines. Soviet defenders had reinforced the city with infantry, artillery, and engineers. Trenches, minefields, and fortified buildings slowed German advances. Despite being under pressure, Soviet forces launched counterattacks to disrupt German formations and prevent encirclement. Coordination among units and knowledge of the urban terrain provided advantages in localized engagements. Street-to-street fighting turned Kharkov into a contested urban battlefield. Civilians were caught in the chaos, many evacuating, while others sought refuge in basements and public shelters. Hospitals and factories were converted into defensive positions, demonstrating the city's transformation into a fortress. Artillery, mortars, and close-quarters combat created a dynamic and destructive environment. The battle revealed both sides' resilience and adaptability. German forces pressed their assault, yet the Soviets demonstrated the capacity to absorb attacks and counter where weaknesses appeared. Kharkov would remain a center of contention for months, illustrating the strategic importance of urban centers on the Eastern Front and the high human cost of war. By January 1942, the Soviet winter counteroffensive against the German advance on Moscow was in full force. German troops, exhausted and ill-equipped for the harsh Russian winter, were forced onto the defensive. The battle was no longer about rapid advances but about survival, endurance, and maintaining fragile defensive lines. The Germans struggled with frozen roads, immobilized tanks, and frostbite among soldiers. Supply lines were stretched thin, and winter conditions made reinforcements and logistics extremely difficult. Infantry units, weakened by fatigue and cold, dug in along defensive positions to resist relentless Soviet attacks. Soviet forces, now better organized and supplied, pushed along multiple fronts. Red Army infantry, supported by artillery and limited tank units, attacked German positions, often in harsh snowstorms that concealed movements and allowed for tactical surprise. Engineers built field fortifications, repaired roads for troop movement, and cleared obstacles to enable continued advances. Civilians in areas near the front lines faced immense hardship. Bombed towns, frozen rivers, and displaced populations added to the logistical and moral challenges for both sides. Many civilians aided the Red Army by providing food, guiding troops, and sheltering wounded soldiers. Despite extreme cold and danger, morale among Soviet defenders was bolstered by a sense of defending the motherland. The defensive struggle near Moscow demonstrated the combined impact of weather, logistics, and human resilience. German forces, though technologically advanced, found themselves constrained by environmental conditions, while Soviet troops adapted and exploited the harsh winter to gain tactical advantages. This period marked a pivotal moment on the Eastern Front. The German inability to secure Moscow before winter, coupled with the Soviet capacity for counteroffensive action, set the stage for prolonged attritional warfare. The battle highlighted that victory in the East required more than strategy and firepower. It demanded endurance, adaptability, and the courage to survive extreme conditions. By February 1942, the siege of Sevastopol had entered its most brutal phase. German and Romanian forces faced fortified Soviet positions that turned every street, building, and coastline into a battleground. The fight for Sevastopol became a test of strategy, firepower, and human endurance under harsh conditions. German forces, led by General Manstein, relied on heavy artillery, engineering units, and combined arms tactics to breach the city's fortifications. Infantry and panzer divisions coordinated assaults on bunkers while Luftwaffe bombers targeted defensive strongpoints and supply depots. Each advance was met with fierce Soviet resistance, creating high casualties and slow progress. Soviet defenders utilized every advantage. Coastal batteries fired on approaching ships, infantry defended street barricades, and engineers reinforced destroyed buildings. Mines and traps slowed German advances while counterattacks aimed to push attackers back. Civilians contributed by transporting supplies, providing medical assistance, and reinforcing barricades, turning Sevastopol into a collective fortress. The harsh Crimean winter further complicated operations. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures impeded movement, affected weapon performance, and increased the risk of frostbite. Despite these conditions, both sides displayed extraordinary resilience, determined to achieve their objectives in a city that had become the symbol of Southern resistance. The intensification of urban warfare in Sevastopol highlighted the human cost of prolonged siege operations. Each block taken demanded careful coordination and tremendous courage, with soldiers exposed to enemy fire, artillery, and harsh conditions. Civilians caught in the crossfire endured constant fear, deprivation, and destruction. Sevastopol's siege demonstrated that victory required not just military skill but endurance, coordination, and the will to survive under extreme conditions. The prolonged battle foreshadowed the continued struggle for Crimea and the immense sacrifices demanded on the Eastern Front. By early 1942, the region around Rzhev became a focal point of brutal fighting between German and Soviet forces. Known later as the Rzhev meat grinder, this series of battles exemplified the grueling attritional warfare that characterized the Eastern Front. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, with relentless artillery bombardments and infantry assaults defining the conflict. German forces had established strong defensive positions, anticipating Soviet attempts to cut supply lines and push toward the rear of Army Group Center. Trenches, bunkers, and minefields created a layered defense that was difficult to penetrate. The Wehrmacht relied on well-coordinated infantry, artillery, and occasional armored support to hold its lines. Soviet forces launched repeated offensives, using massed infantry, artillery barrages, and limited tank units to break through German defenses. The fighting was intense and often hand-to-hand in trenches and forested areas. Supply shortages, harsh winter conditions, and exhaustion tested both sides. Morale fluctuated, but Soviet determination and persistence kept assaults ongoing. The civilian population, caught in the crossfire, endured destruction, displacement, and starvation. Villages were leveled by artillery, and those who remained faced extreme conditions and limited access to food and medical care. Many assisted Soviet troops by providing intelligence, shelter, or logistical support. The Battle of Rzhev highlighted the horrific human cost of the Eastern Front. Each meter of ground gained came at immense loss, and both armies realized that strategic objectives often demanded sacrifices beyond imagination. The battle also demonstrated the Soviet capacity for endurance and the German vulnerability when forced into static defensive positions. Ultimately, Rzhev exemplified the protracted, bloody nature of war on the Eastern Front. It served as a stark reminder that victory would require immense resources, determination, and endurance, with human lives bearing the heaviest burden. In early 1942, the German 16th Army found itself in a precarious position near Demyansk, north of Leningrad. Soviet forces launched encirclement operations, surrounding the Germans in what would become the Demyansk pocket. This battle demonstrated the strategic significance of supply lines, air support, and defensive coordination in the Eastern Front. Trapped German forces relied on fortified positions, trenches, and bunkers to withstand constant Soviet assaults. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, shortages of food and ammunition, and relentless artillery barrages. Despite the harsh conditions, morale remained surprisingly high due to disciplined leadership and determination to hold out until relief arrived. Soviet attackers aimed to annihilate or force the surrender of the encircled German forces. Infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, and coordinated attacks tested German resilience daily. Guerrilla activities and reconnaissance units probed weaknesses, attempting to cut supply routes and intensify pressure. The Luftwaffe played a crucial role in sustaining German forces. Airdrops delivered food, ammunition, and medical supplies, enabling the troops to continue holding their positions despite being cut off. Pilots flew dangerous missions over contested airspace, braving enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Civilians in surrounding areas were caught in the turmoil, with villages burned, destroyed, or occupied. Some assisted German units, providing local knowledge and labor, while others fled the fighting entirely. The human toll was immense, illustrating the broader cost of the Eastern Front beyond formal battle lines. The encirclement of Demyansk highlighted the complexity of modern warfare on the Eastern Front. It showed the vital importance of air logistics, fortifications, and coordination under extreme conditions. While the pocket was eventually relieved, The battle left a lasting impression on both sides regarding the challenges of protracted attritional warfare. By mid-1942, Kharkov once again became a major battleground in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. After initial Soviet advances, German forces launched a well-coordinated counteroffensive to regain control of the strategic city. The operation highlighted the Wehrmacht's tactical skill, coordination, and the devastating impact of combined arms warfare. German panzer divisions spearheaded the assault, supported by infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe airstrikes. The aim was to encircle Soviet forces and cut off their supply lines. Precise planning, rapid movement, and exploitation of weak points in Soviet defenses allowed German forces to regain the initiative. Soviet defenders, despite being caught off guard, fought fiercely. Infantry held defensive positions in urban areas, engineers reinforced barricades, and artillery units attempted to halt the German advance. Street-to-street fighting turned Kharkov into a deadly urban battlefield. Civilians were trapped in the chaos, many fleeing or taking shelter in basements and public buildings. The German counteroffensive demonstrated the lethality of mobile warfare and coordination between armored units, infantry, and air support. Soviet troops suffered significant casualties, but pockets of resistance continued to slow German progress. Despite the high human cost, the operation restored German control over Kharkov and provided a strategic staging point for further operations in southern Russia and Ukraine. The battle illustrated the brutal nature of the Eastern Front, where urban warfare, attrition, and rapid maneuvers combined to create devastating consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. The human cost was enormous, with thousands of casualties on both sides, highlighting the relentless and unforgiving nature of war in the East. By mid-1942, the siege of Leningrad had reached its second year, with civilians and defenders enduring severe deprivation. The blockade imposed by German and Finnish forces had cut off nearly all supply lines, creating a humanitarian catastrophe. Despite this, the city's population displayed extraordinary resilience, maintaining industrial output and military defense under extreme conditions. German and Finnish forces continued artillery bombardments and air raids, attempting to crush resistance and compel surrender. Artillery shells devastated residential areas and industrial centers, while Luftwaffe bombers targeted supply routes and defensive positions. Engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly to repair infrastructure and maintain communication lines under constant threat. Inside the city, food shortages were extreme. Citizens relied on rationing, scavenging, and whatever meager supplies could be brought in via the road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga. Civilians, including women and children, contributed to industrial production, hospitals, and defense preparations, displaying remarkable courage in the face of starvation and bombardment. Soviet soldiers manned defensive positions along the city's perimeter and reinforced fortifications. Artillery units returned fire, and reconnaissance patrols monitored enemy movements. The coordination between civilians and military personnel exemplified the collective effort required to sustain resistance against overwhelming odds. The siege of Leningrad demonstrated the interplay between human endurance, strategic defense, and environmental challenges. German forces, despite superior firepower, were unable to force a surrender, highlighting the resilience and determination of the city's inhabitants and defenders. Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet resolve, proving that endurance, unity, and courage could withstand even the harshest conditions of war. The blockade left a lasting legacy, emphasizing the human cost of prolonged siege warfare, the importance of logistical planning, and the resilience required to survive under extreme adversity. By August 1942, German forces had reached Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. The capture of Stalingrad was intended to secure the eastern flank of the southern offensive, protect supply lines, and weaken Soviet morale. What began as a tactical objective quickly evolved into one of the bloodiest urban battles in history. German units advanced into the city with infantry, tanks, and artillery, facing immediate resistance from Soviet defenders who had prepared fortified positions, barricades, and sniper nests. Urban combat dominated the battle, with every street, factory, and apartment building becoming a contested site. Artillery barrages and airstrikes were used to soften Soviet defenses, but the close-quarters fighting negated many of the Wehrmacht's advantages. Soviet forces fought tenaciously, turning Stalingrad into a fortress city. Engineers reinforced buildings, mined streets, and created strongpoints to slow the German advance. Civilians who remained in the city faced constant bombardment, destruction of homes, and shortages of food and medical supplies. Many assisted soldiers, carrying ammunition, providing medical aid, or helping reinforce barricades. The battle quickly became a war of attrition. German troops faced fierce resistance and struggled with extended supply lines, while Soviet forces leveraged the urban terrain to inflict maximum casualties. Every block gained by the Wehrmacht came at a heavy cost, with street-to-street combat creating horrific conditions for soldiers and civilians alike. The beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in the Eastern Front. It demonstrated the determination of the Red Army to defend strategic cities at all costs, the limits of German tactical advantage in urban warfare, and the staggering human cost of prolonged conflict. The struggle for Stalingrad would continue for months, shaping the future course of the war. By late 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had descended into brutal close-quarters combat. Streets, factories, and apartment buildings became deadly arenas as German and Soviet soldiers fought for every meter. Urban warfare neutralized many German advantages, forcing them into grueling house-to-house fighting where each position could become a death trap. German forces attempted to push through the city in a series of coordinated assaults, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe airstrikes. However, Soviet defenders held key buildings, ambushed enemy patrols, and used snipers to inflict severe casualties. Mines and booby traps slowed German advances, turning the city into a deadly labyrinth. Civilians endured constant bombardment, extreme shortages of food, and widespread destruction. Many risked their lives to aid soldiers by carrying ammunition, tending to the wounded, and reinforcing barricades. The human cost of the battle was staggering, with entire families trapped amidst the chaos. The intense combat demonstrated the resilience, ingenuity, and determination of both sides. The struggle for Stalingrad became symbolic of the war itself, relentless, unforgiving, and shaped by the courage and suffering of those involved. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive aimed at encircling German forces in Stalingrad. The Red Army attacked weaker Romanian and Hungarian units guarding the flanks, exploiting the overextended German positions. The pincer movement was swift and devastating. German troops were caught off guard, with their supply lines cut and rear positions under attack. Infantry, tanks, and artillery moved to encircle the city, while partisans disrupted communication and transport routes. Civilians witnessed the chaos as front lines shifted and cities were abandoned or destroyed. Soviet coordination and numerical superiority forced German troops onto the defensive. The operation demonstrated the importance of logistics, intelligence, and timing in large-scale warfare. The German Sixth Army, previously advancing confidently, now faced encirclement and dwindling supplies. By late November 1942, German forces in Stalingrad were fully encircled. The Sixth Army, trapped in the city, faced dwindling supplies, harsh winter conditions, and constant Soviet attacks. Morale plummeted as starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment took their toll. The Luftwaffe attempted supply drops, but harsh weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire limited effectiveness. Infantry fortified buildings, artillery fired sporadically, and civilians endured the worst conditions of the war. The encirclement demonstrated that even the most disciplined army could be undone by strategy, environment, and persistence. German officers faced impossible decisions, balancing orders with the reality of human suffering. By early 1943, the encircled Sixth Army faced extreme hunger and disease. Soldiers and civilians alike struggled to survive as food and medical supplies ran out. Despite this, Pockets of resistance continued to fight fiercely, refusing surrender. The city was a wasteland. Fires burned uncontrollably, buildings crumbled, and corpses littered streets. Civilians and soldiers alike displayed extraordinary resilience, improvising to endure the siege. In February 1943, after months of siege, starvation, and relentless Soviet attacks, the German Sixth Army surrendered. Survivors were captured, and the city had been devastated. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and a turning point on the Eastern Front. The surrender shocked the world. German morale plummeted, while Soviet confidence soared. The battle demonstrated that determination, strategy, and endurance could overcome even the most experienced forces. The fall of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. The Eastern Front would see a shift in momentum toward the Soviets. Survivors recounted the horrors of winter, starvation, urban combat, and human resilience. The battle highlighted the staggering cost of war, the bravery of civilians and soldiers alike, and the limits of even the most formidable armies. The Eastern Front remained brutal, but Stalingrad became a symbol of hope and determination. The lessons learned from the campaign echoed throughout subsequent operations, influencing strategy, logistics, and morale. As we conclude this journey across the Eastern Front, we are confronted by the magnitude of human courage, suffering, and resilience. From the frozen forests and bitter winters to the burning streets of Stalingrad, the stories of soldiers and civilians reveal the unyielding spirit of those who endured unimaginable hardship. Millions of lives were changed forever, families torn apart, cities destroyed, and entire generations tested by the extremes of war. Yet amid this devastation, acts of extraordinary bravery and sacrifice illuminated the human spirit. Ordinary men and women became defenders of their homeland, standing firm against despair and fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The Eastern Front teaches lessons about endurance, strategy, and the costs of ambition. It reminds us of the fragility and strength of life, the price of conflict, and the power of determination in shaping history. As we reflect on these events, may we honor the memories of those who fought, endured, and persevered. May their stories inspire courage, empathy, and a deeper understanding of the human spirit, which even in the darkest times remains unbroken.